running an effective nonprofit, and in particular, being a good board member, requires a great deal of commitment. There's a lot to do. It's very complicated, it's messy, and it's not easy. We have to make sure that there's enough money coming in and that the resources are being spent wisely. We have to make sure the financial statements, we understand them and that they're in good shape and that they're audited in one form or another. We have to make sure that the programs are functioning well and have a good set of outcomes and that we know what those outcomes are and we can make changes when we need to make changes. We have to make sure that the staff is happy and functioning well and have all of the resources they need to do a good job. We have to make sure that we communicate our message to the public and that we're good ambassadors for the organization. It's a lot we have to do. And generally, we do that work with a cast of characters that looks something like this. We've got the guy who's always late, so we end up waiting around for those board members who don't arrive on time. Then we have the folks who are no-shows. They say they're going to come to a meeting, and they don't show up. We have the people who don't read their materials in advance of the meeting. We know this is a core responsibility. How can you make good decisions unless you review the materials and read them carefully? We have people who point fingers. We have people who run to get through the agenda, which is a little crazy, and they don't leave us enough time to talk about things. We have people who revisit those decisions that we've already made. We have the whiners. We have the clowns. And thankfully, we have the Pollyannas who cheer us on and are always optimistic. So that's what we have to do. We've got to work with that cast of characters, and I know you recognize yourself in some of these people or people you serve with on a board of directors. So we work with all of these people doing this very complicated task of stewarding the work of a nonprofit organization. So at USD, when we teach about governance and how to work with a crazy cast of characters like this to accomplish all of those things that you know you have to do at board members, we refer to a framework of governance that was developed by our friend Richard Chait at Harvard University. And there are 3 modes of his framework that's fiduciary, strategic, and generative. And I'm going to describe those 2 in brief and use them as a jumping off point for talking about how boards can really function differently and ideally more effectively. So the first frame is the fiduciary frame, and that's your due diligence work that you have to do regarding your legal and financial obligations to make sure that you have your resources and that they're being deployed in the best possible way to advance your mission. It involves making sure that you're on task so that your programs are flowing from your mission. And it really is the most fundamental form of governance. It's not just making sure all the trains are running on time. It's also asking those ethical questions, questions about costs and benefits, setting priorities. It's a critical form of governance, and quite frankly, it's where most board members focus their energies. But we have to be careful that we're not only focused on the fiduciary responsibilities. We also need to be in a strategic thinking space. And when I say strategic, a lot of times people think, oh, planning. This is different. This really involves asking the big questions that are facing the organization and working with the staff to look at issues in a much broader respect. So, for example, we might ask ourselves, what can we as board members and staff members do to enhance the image of the organization? What might we do to build the capacity of our staff in ways that are cost-effective and innovative? And how might we better serve the people in our community, talking to them and getting some of their ideas? So it's not only allowing for this big picture thinking, which is so important. But it's asking ourselves as board members, what can we do? What's our role in advancing these opportunities that we identify? You know, the board has a wonderful perspective, and this is this 35,000-foot perspective. As staff members, we're there thinking about and dreaming about this work for 80 hours a week. But board members can come in with a different kind of view to the work and have a broader approach to how we think about things. Now, perhaps the highest form of governance is something that Chait refers to as generative thinking. And generative thinking is going beyond the fiduciary and the strategic, and it's looking at global issues that are at play. So it's asking the board and staff to reframe the big questions, to make sense of knowledge and information, to wrestle with the forces that are at play, and to recognize that as human beings entering a boardroom, each of us has a different perspective and history and experience that we're going to bring to the discussion. So it's a way for board members, this generative thinking is a way for board members to get more deeply engaged and to exercise their leadership skills. I want to give you a very concrete example. At USD, we have an annual award for excellence in nonprofit governance. We're very proud of this award, and we're very proud of the organizations that have won it over the years. And several years ago, one of our winners was an organization called San Diego Youth Symphony. And they ran a first-class youth orchestra. I mean, just extraordinary. Very talented kids playing the most beautiful classical music, just amazing. And they wrestled with a question. Should we be bringing music to kids, or should we be bringing kids to music? And they were particularly thinking about how do they engage with low-income kids and low-income communities. And they decided to reframe the way they were looking at things. And they engaged in a number of new initiatives. And the organization just soared and became even more powerful than it was by bringing kids to music. It was very exciting. So they blossomed. But a lot of times, our organizations, let's face it, we're just stuck in a bubble. Right? We're really stuck in those fiduciary and maybe strategic roles, and we don't ask ourselves the biggest question. I mean, how often do we ask ourselves about global issues that are facing the world and our nonprofit as a result? How often do we think about our role as a charity and what it means in society? For example, we talk about, at USD, we talk about nonprofits being in the forefront of innovation and experimentation. We exist because we can try things that are on the ground, and we can fail. Ladies and gentlemen, it is okay to try something and have it not work out. We are a laboratory for innovation and experimentation. And that's a framework that you could use to think about at your board meetings. How about this one? We undergird the private sector. What? People are always surprised when I say that. But here we are in San Diego, and we allow for-profit companies to recruit talent to come live here because they say, wow, we have fantastic museums. They're nonprofits. We have a wonderful healthcare system. Nonprofits. We have terrific private schools your children can go to. Nonprofits. We have beautiful beaches cleaned by nonprofits, protected by nonprofits. There's so many things that the nonprofit sector does that enable the for-profit sector to do its thing. So we really are the civil society that holds things together. So, but how do we get our organizations to engage in this kind of broad thinking? So let's take a few minutes to take a look at some of the global issues that are facing our sector. First of all, I think many of you are aware that Congress is having serious discussions about reducing or eliminating the charitable tax deduction. And this is something that President Obama has put forth for the past several years. Now, there are all kinds of estimates, conflicting estimates, about the consequences that this would have on nonprofit organizations. The folks at the American Enterprise Institute estimate that it would negatively affect charitable giving to the tune of $9 billion a year. Our friends at Indiana University's Center on Philanthropies say, nah, it would only have a $3.2 billion a year impact. The reality is nobody knows what kind of impact it would have. But I do know this. If there is a cap on the charitable tax deduction, or if it's eliminated, it's going to affect every single nonprofit in this room. Every single one of you. I also know, according to the Global Giving Index, that the US is 13th in individual charitable contributions. 13th. We're not even among the top 10. So this is something that all of us need to worry about, and all of you should be discussing at your board meetings. It's a very important issue. I want to ask you all a question. How many of you work or are on the board of nonprofit organizations that serve low-income people? So many, many people in the room. Well, what's happening to programs that help low-income people? We know that in fall of 2013, food stamps were reduced by an average of $30 per household. Then, at the beginning of 2014, Congress voted and the President signed a bill to reduce food stamps by $8 billion over the next 10 years. That will reduce benefits per household to roughly $90 per household. We also know that 1.3 million people didn't have their unemployment benefits extended at the end of 2013. So what does that mean? What do those big numbers mean? They mean that low-income people are going to come to us, come to our nonprofits for help. Where are we going to get the resources to help these people? Certainly not from government. So what are we going to do? So how many of your organizations and how many of you individually contacted your congresspeople about this issue? How many of you had a discussion at the board level about this and about the impact that this might have on the services that you provide? I'm going to give you one more example. How many of you annually evaluate the pay of the top executive of your nonprofit? Good, good. I'm happy to see that you're engaged in that because everybody knows that's the best practice. All right, you get a gold star for doing that. But do you also take a look at the lowest paid person at your organization? Now, I know many of you, in fact, most nonprofits, employ people who earn minimum wage. And the irony is that if we're running social service agencies, we employ people who take advantage of the services that we provide. Now, why is it that people who work full-time should have to rely on additional support provided by our nonprofits? Should they? Should we be talking about issues of living wage and adequate wages for the people we employ? These are the kind of discussions that it's critically important for all of you to be having at the board level. And this is what's meant by generative thinking. But it's hard. It's really hard. People understand that this kind of thinking needs to be brought into the boardroom, but how do we start these conversations? I'm going to give you 3 suggestions. The first one involves collaboration and collective impact. Last year, and even currently, we engaged in a consulting project to the emergency food providers in San Diego. We looked at where food is coming from and where it's going, and how can we get organizations to collaborate on food distribution, warehousing, processing, and to help people so that if they're standing in a line to get emergency food one month, they won't be standing in that same line the next month. So we convened this group. We had meetings with staff and board, and we're doing ongoing work now to find very definite solutions so that we can move forward and work together more effectively. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that those conversations are only happening at the staff level. That whole project was initiated by a man named Vince Kasparek, who is the chairperson of the board of St. Vincent de Paul. And the reason he came to us to work on this project is because in between CEOs of the organization, while they were doing the search, he took over as the interim director of the organization. And within a short period of time, he and a colleague at the organization realized $1 million in food savings a year. That's $1 million. That was a quarter of their annual budget for emergency food. And he said, if we do things differently, we can work more effectively. That's strategic thinking. The generative thinking came when he came to me and said, Pat, help us figure out how, as a system, how we can work with other organizations in San Diego, the food banks and the provider agencies, to make a bigger impact. That's generative thinking. Advocacy. Now, many of you know that I have written a book called the Lobbying Strategy Handbook, and I'm an advocate for advocacy and for lobbying in particular. And I know people get scared about lobbying. Let me be clear. It is 100% legal for any 501c3 organization to engage in lobbying, 100% legal. No, you can't endorse a candidate, but there's lots that you can do. And there are some really simple things you can do. So, for example, all of you should be on a first-name basis with all of the elected officials that serve the district in which your organization operates. You should have pictures of yourself and your city council members and your state legislators and your congresspeople in your office and on your website. You should know them. You should host candidates' debates, register people to vote, have ongoing and open dialogues with your elected officials about the things that are important to the people you serve and to your organization. They're there, ladies and gentlemen, to serve you. They want to do this. So being involved in advocacy and having a board-level discussion about advocacy and what it means for your organization and what issues you should be advocating on is an important role for your board to have. And if those two things seem like they're too difficult for you to wrap your mind around, you can do something really simple, which is change the way you do business. So what do I mean by that? You can appoint someone or more than one person to play the role of devil's advocate during your board meetings. And please don't have it be the same person at every meeting because they're really going to be picked on. It's a great idea to rotate this role so that you can have someone challenging ideas. You want to make sure, too, that you purposely build time into your agenda for big thinking. You want to ask your board, what is the most valuable thing that we can be doing right now to advance our work? What are the external factors that are going on in your community or in the United States or beyond that are having an impact on your work? Those are the kinds of things that you can talk about. You can be brave if you want and go out and meet other board members. You can look at boards of directors that do, and organizations that do similar work to yours, and you can set up a time to have an exchange with them. There's lots of opportunity for sharing ideas and for collaborating. And most nonprofit board people are pretty nice, and staff people too. So you'll find that they'll be willing to engage in these kinds of dialogues with you. So it's time for a clean start. It's time to stop clowning around. And it's time to look at your role as a nonprofit board member in a new way. Thank you.